Hello there, and welcome to Smith and Sheridan, a podcast on the science and business of biotechnology, presented by me, Cormac Sheridan.
And me, Andy Smith. Hello, everyone. Hello, Cormac. How are you this week?
I'm good. How are you, Andy?
I'm a bit tired, a bit fatigued, having stayed up most of the night to watch our election results. And as a very tenuous lead-in, fatigue is one of the symptoms of one of the rare diseases we're going to talk about today.
Yes, but at the same time, sleep deprivation more likely is the cause of your fatigue rather than an autoimmune attack on the neuromuscular junction.
Well, I hope so anyway, yeah.
And so apologies, folks, for that rather meandering lead-in. But the topic of today's chat is a relatively rare and maybe slightly overlooked autoimmune disease called Myasthenia Gravis, which literally means grave muscle weakness.
Oh, you looked up the Latin. Well done.
I did. And also I did a bit of digging around. This is a condition that has been known about for about 400 years. Or maybe 350 years at least. It was first described in the 17th century, and some of that knowledge was lost until the early 20th century. But it's basically myasthenia gravis. The kind of main sort of symptoms, they are highly variable, but it's weakness and fatigue, and muscles that are commonly affected include those that involve the control of the eyes and eyelid movement, so you can get this drooping eye effect. Facial expression as well, chewing, talking, swallowing, but also breathing and just general kind of ability to function. And it's particularly characterized by fatigue resulting from activity, and then the fatigue is relieved just by rest. So it's quite specific. And it's interesting, two of Britain's more famous actors, Laurence Olivier and David Niven.
Sir Laurence Olivier, actually.
Sir Laurence Olivier. Younger listeners mightn't have heard of either, but they both bestrode the stage and screen like colossi in their time. They both had the condition, actually. And typically people live a fairly full life. It's not life-threatening in a way that other severe autoimmune conditions can be. Now, there can be respiratory failure, which is obviously very serious. And an acute crisis that does occur can happen, according to one report, in about 20% of patients, and they may need ICU hospitalization, ICU, plasma exchange, intravenous immunoglobulin, all that heavy duty stuff. But for managing the disease, there is a growing list of approved therapeutics, many of which have a sort of a, not surprisingly, immunological mechanism. I mean, basically, just to sort of go through the actual sort of the disease drivers, most patients, according to what I've been reading in the literature, 85% of patients have auto-antibodies directed against the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors that are widespread on many neuromuscular junctions on the neuro side, if you like. And basically, these generally respond to the release of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine when it's released at the synapse. But because of these autoantibodies that block the acetylcholine receptors, you just don't get this efficient signal propagation, and you don't get basically the muscles firing in a way that they should be in response to a nervous stimulus. And that's 85%. There's other less prevalent autoantigens include muscle-specific kinase, also known as MuSK. Also a low-density lipoprotein receptor-related protein 4, best known as LRP4, and a bunch of other less frequent antigens as well can also be players. And typically these are proteins that play some role in the neuromuscular junction.
And those patients are quite delineated from the larger population you're talking about, aren't they? Because there's no activation of complement. It's a different class of antibodies. So most of the drugs that we're going to talk about don't work in those patients.
Yeah, although in some, I think the jury is kind of still out. I think that some of the clinical trials have to be done because, okay, you have complement-mediated damage occurs and you have complement inhibitors that are approved.
Yes. It
wouldn't amaze me to hear that there was complement-mediated damage at any dysfunctional neuromuscular junction. And some of the antibodies have a generalized mechanism, talking in particular about the FC, neonatal receptor antibodies, which basically have a generalized effect on the circulatory half-life of IgG antibodies. And therefore, it doesn't really matter what they're directed against, whether it's the acetylcholine receptor or the musk kinase or LRP4. Generally speaking, if you have an auto-antibody attack on any autoantigen, that type of approach you would hope would work regardless of the actual target of the actual autoantibody. You know what I mean?
But it made me wonder whether the actual use of the antibodies directed against the fetal IgG component, they're IG1 and IG3 antibodies, whereas the musk diversion is IgG4. So you could almost treat with that. If patients don't respond, you could say, it could be musk antibodies.
Well, I think, though, that, IgG, I don't necessarily think that the neonatal Fc receptor distinguishes between the subclasses. I think it generally, it functions to basically maintain in circulation all IgG antibodies, as far as I know, anyway.
Right. Okay.
And
sorry, it was my mistake. So IgG4 antibodies don't activate complement. So you could treat with the complement inhibitors, and if the patients don't respond, then you could say it's possibly musk. But there's surgery. A lot of the indications we talked about, there are historical treatments like immunosuppressants and surgery if it's a thyroidectomy. So lots of old things as well as
surgery is very important here, because just to look at the disease, it is idiopathic, but what is definitely of note is that the thymus, which normally is the so-called gland of childhood, and basically isn't present to any significant extent in adults, it actually can often be present and enlarged in people with myasthenia gravis. And so there are sort of ideas, at least, that the root of the sort of immune dysfunction that occurs in the condition is in some way related to the persistence of the thymus. And I think about half of patients have a large thymus, as far as I know. And there was a seriously good trial done, reported in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2016, the MGTX trial. So the MGTX trial very elegantly assessed whether or not thymectomy had any benefit, and it did. Basically, they compared thymectomy plus the immunosuppressant prednisone with prednisone alone, and they had improvements on the time-weighted average myasthenia gravis score, time measured over the course of 3 years. So again, you had a larger reduction from baseline versus on the thymectomy plus prednisone arm. Similarly, and this was also very elegant, your treating physicians that weren't locked into how much prednisone you took. People were taking the drug every second day, and they took as much as required to get symptom relief. And over the course of the 3-year study, those who'd had thymectomy took 32 milligrams every other day, whereas those in the prednisone-only arm took 54 milligrams every other day.
Right.
So you're taking a higher dose of corticosteroids, which indicates maybe that you needed more, but also then you have the side effects that come with steroid therapy.
Yeah, which we try to avoid more and more these days.
Exactly. And also a very elegant endpoint, hospitalization due to exacerbations.
Yes.
37% such events in the prednisone-only arm versus 9% in the thymectomy plus prednisone standpoint.
Right.
So thymectomy is a very important role in this, definitely.
There are patients with thyroid tumours that also have myasthenia gravis, but I'm guessing
they're separate from this trial because
they're much more easily
anyway.
treated. So you remove the cause of it. And for me, it's a frustration in a lot of our discussions. And you mentioned it's idiopathic, and lots of molecular biology and modern medicine techniques have identified the antibodies against the acetylcholine receptors that are responsible for the mediation of the disease. But what on earth triggers that sort of autoimmune response? That's still the big unknown. And we see this time and time again, don't we?
Yeah, we do. And I think it's well beyond my pay grade.
Yeah.
I wouldn't dare to comment on your pay grade, sir, but in explaining that, because we all know as well the variation in response that patients have to approved drug therapies. I mean, if you just look at, Argenx obviously is a company that is become a European kind of powerhouse doing extremely clever things. What I find interesting about the company in general is that they've built themselves into a market cap of 20-odd billion and more just doing antibody-based therapeutics. They're not doing bispecifics, they're not doing ADCs, they're just doing plain, ordinary, decent antibodies. Now, albeit they are from llamas, but they're not nanobodies. Llamas produce both nanobodies which their compatriots Adlink's pioneered.
Yes, yeah.
But the achievement at argenx is greatly surpassed that at Adlink's at this point because they've taken drugs to market themselves and they retain marketing rights. So Vyvgart or efgartigimod, their lead product, I mean, they pioneered this class of neonatal Fc receptor blockers. But in their phase 3 study that got them their FDA approval back in late 2021, 67.7% of people on the active drug were responders, but as much as 29.7% on placebo were also responders, which shows you the variable course of the condition.
Yeah. There are some patients who are virtually, once the disease progresses, and it is a progressive disease, disabled by that. And the mortality rate in the myasthenia gravis is 2%. So it's a wild variation of these.
So there's a whole bunch of other companies have followed argenx's lead in developing these neonatal Fc receptor blockers. There's UCB, another Belgian firm, although from the other part of Belgium. They're Brussels-based rather than Flanders-based. And of course, argenx are kind of sort of Dutch and sort of Flemish. They're a bit of both.
They're probably more predominance of French than Flemish in argenx. And
no, argenx is Flemish and Dutch, like us, the Netherlands, I think. But no, UCB would be Brussels and have more francophone type of orientation.
Right, okay. Got it the wrong way around, yeah.
So UCB, they got an FDA approval in June of last year with Ristingo, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, an antibody called rosanolixizumab, which is another neonatal Fc receptor blocker. And again, they had a very good reduction in their MG-ADL score, MGB, Myasthenia Gravis Activities of Daily Living score. It's a 24-point scale. It assesses 8 different functional parameters, and you're scored from 0 to 3 points. And a 2-point improvement is considered clinically meaningful. It doesn't sound like a huge amount on a scale of 0 to 24, but that's clinically acceptable. So here they had a 3.4 mean reduction versus 0.8 in the placebo arm, so they just about get above the 2.6 points there. And of course, because these are averaged out over the 2 arms, I presume there's large variations, and some people respond better than others. And also Harbour Biomed, a Chinese firm, they also have another neonatal Fc receptor blocker, and I haven't seen the data, but they just said they met the primary endpoint of a phase 3 trial in 132 patients. And they had filed it originally with China's National Medical Products Administration, but then they've refiled just last month, in fact, June 2024. They needed to compile some additional long-term safety data, which they now said they're done, and it's all good.
I didn't mean to be disparaging earlier, but these companies that have used or are using the neonatal Fc receptor antagonist as a way of treating myasthenia gravis. I mean, yes, it's not related to the etiology of the disease, but hats off to whoever thought of, well, we don't need a generalized B-cell depletion. We only need to take down the antibodies that are causing the damage and the specific subsets of the antibodies. And the way to do that is to target the neonatal Fc receptor. I mean, I would never have thought of that.
And it's very elegant. And I think that the clinical possibilities are quite large. And I know that argenx as a whole, the usual sort of pipeline in a molecule type of strategy around this drug. And J&J, just for completeness, is also there with nipocalimab. They put out data just very recently, and they're claiming a very long duration of response. They were looking at a couple of years, even I can't remember the exact details. But again, they were getting an improvement of 4.7 points in the MG-ADL score versus 3.25 though in the placebo arm. Each arm is on standard of care too. So that means that the separation there isn't massive. It falls below the 2-point threshold. And at least one of the merchant banks there, investment banks rather, their analyst team, TD Cowen's team, basically were saying it's not a threat to the argenx product Vyvgart, which is now a blockbuster product. It reported attained rather $398 million sales in the first quarter of this year, so it's definitely the blockbuster.
We were talking earlier about mostly this treatment's directed against myasthenia gravis. It seems to be the preserve of biotech companies, partly because it's a rare disease. And then contrary to that, you'd say, well, there's AstraZeneca, right? But then AstraZeneca's products came from the Alexion acquisition, a rare disease company. But now you've got the BL that's J&J doing it. So, I mean, it is encouraging that the whole spectrum is looking at such a rare disease.
And it's interesting to me that, I mean, Alexion obviously sold out to AstraZeneca for about 38 billion or something.
Yeah.
And I'd say if somebody wanted to buy argenx, they'd end up paying something like that too. They'd have to pay a considerable premium to their current market cap. They're not unalike in terms of developing antibody-based therapies for very rare conditions. But what's interesting though is that The Alexion story, I mean, those products, the complement C5 inhibitors, they're serious weapons. And the FDA labels for both Soliris and its successor, the longer-acting drug
Ultomiris, yeah.
They both carry black box warnings for life-threatening and fatal meningococcal infections.
Yeah.
So they're only available to a REMS program.
It is interesting. And my script article for next week actually talks about the distinction between the acquisitions that big pharma has made for companies like AstraZeneca buying Alexion, and then some of the other bigger companies with market caps today that are a similar size to the 39 billion that AstraZeneca bought Alexion for. The difference, however, is that whereas PAH, nocturnal hemoglobinuria, PNH, paroxysmal, that's the indication that
paroxysmal nocturnal what?
Hemoglobinuria, so blood in the urine. There you go. So that indication is something like 15 to 16 million people.
Yeah.
Whereas myasthenia gravis and some of the other rare diseases that many biotech companies are now presumed to be acquisition targets are much, much smaller populations. And that's why I think the sector may have got ahead of itself. Biotech, a big pharma company, won't fork out that same amount of money for much less of a return. But that's an aside.
Yeah, well, argenx does have a blockbuster drug in its hands already, and they're kind of just getting going in a sense. There's a whole bunch of other niche immunological indications that they're going for. The same drug is approved in primary immune thrombocytopenia as well. And they have a whole bunch of other things on the go too. Quite interesting, actually. But coming back to myasthenia gravis, there's other approaches too that are kind of interesting. One is, again, this was recent, and actually just for completeness, the Alexion AstraZeneca story doesn't end. They're now in phase 3 with another antibody called ALXN 1720 is the easy part.
something UMAB, it ends in.
Yeah, gefurulimab. Gefurulimab? Oh, it's terrible. It's a humanized bispecific heavy chain only antibody that targets complement C5. So it replicates the earlier mechanism, but it also targets human serum albumin. So it's even longer circulatory half-life.
Yeah.
So it's in phase 3. I haven't seen data for it, but that's interesting. But here's another interesting one. And this was, again, just very recent data, Cartesian Therapeutics.
Yes, that was this week. That was earlier this week, I think. And suffice to say, the stock price fell by about a third when they announced that positive data. So.
Yeah. It bounced back up by about 11% yesterday when I checked. I don't know where it's at today, but it certainly took a hit. But then they did raise a big chunk of cash too on the back of it. So all is not lost. But the name of the therapy is Descartes-08, slightly unusual name for cell therapy. And it's an autologous CAR T cell therapy with a difference. And I must say, I do like the idea because this is an autologous CAR T cell therapy that you do not have to
precondition the patients.
Yeah, you don't have to expose them to lymphodepletion. And that means it can be administered in community settings. You don't actually have to do the whole business like it's a bone marrow transplant and all the attendant heavyweight medical care that accompanies it. So what happens is that they just take the mRNA and pop it into the cells ex vivo, and could ultimately, potentially, if you got the technology right, see this as an in vivo therapy. But it is done ex vivo, so you do have to do the T-cell isolation piece and all the rest of it. But the cells express the chimeric antigen receptor, which in this case is directed at B-cell maturation antigen.
Yeah.
And they only express it transiently on their cell surface as long as the RNA persists, and then it's degraded quite quickly. So you get this transient effect that you have a T-cell that for a brief moment of its time expresses this antigen, and in that way would hopefully attack the population of B-cells that are... Now, it's a generalized B-cell depletion approach. It's not selective. So you are getting that kind of B-cell ablation. And I haven't seen the safety data, but they're saying in the phase 2b trial, they reported on this week, 71% of patients in the active treatment arm and 25% of patients in the placebo arm had a treatment response defined as a 5-point or greater improvement in the MG composite score, which is a 60-point instrument based on 10 parameters. composed, they say, of selected components of other validated scales to measure NG severity and impact.
Yeah.
But the problem was, of course, that they only did the assessment in some of the patients and not in all of the patients.
Oh, I mean, there is so much to unpack with that study. But on the other hand, I do like the Cartesian approach, right? Because it combines two of the big elephants in the therapeutic room of our time, CAR T cellular therapies and mRNA in one product.
Yes.
And it also provides a paradox, right? Because you think cellular therapy, one of the proponents or many of the attractiveness of cellular therapy is that those cells are persistent. They last for a year or so. But then the paradox is you've got expressing BCMA just for a short period of time, but you've got the cells that persist. But the big issue that early on this week led to the stock price is there was a lot of statistical and clinical trial jiggery-pokery, as you mentioned, change of populations, change of primary endpoint, which quite rightly typically scares investors. So I'd love it to succeed, but it's where we are for the moment. And they're going into phase 3 because they raised money to do that. But the aftermath of the study is quite opaque.
Yeah, there is a sort of, if you like, a lingering sort of cloud around it.
Yes.
And it's up to them to dispel that. And it's a question of whether they can do that. But they are funded now to do it. But it's a tall ask for that management, all right. It is difficult.
And the other aspect why I think investors were bemused, if you like, was that because there was no data on I mean, there was some data. Some of the patients were on existing standard of care. Some of the patients were on C5 esterase and C5 complement inhibitors. Some of them were on other therapies, the FC receptor therapies. So it's a bit murky about what actually they got in the results. And time will tell, I suppose.
Yeah. And there is at least one other CAR T-cell program in the clinic. Kyverna Therapeutics are just doing a more conventional CD9-directed CAR T-cell therapy. They're in phase 2. The latest update I got was that as of May 24th, they'd treated 8 patients. And I think there was some disclosure at a conference that I didn't attend. And as far as I can see, the data are not available online. But that's one to look for as well. Again, though, it's a fairly heavy weapon against a non-life-threatening autoimmune condition for which there were quite a few drugs currently available. I mean, I suppose the idea is that you may have a curative outcome. And maybe this is indicated for patients who undergo crisis regularly or who have severe disease.
Yes, I mean, it's important to say non-life-threatening in about 98% of patients. But then, as you say, Cormac, the most advanced therapies like CAR-Ts, they'll be directed towards the most severe end of the spectrum. And when you start to do that, you salami slice the number of patients, the effective market, and then worryingly to payers, the amount you have to charge to make a profit from that sort of small patient population.
Yeah, exactly. And at the other end of the spectrum, I think there's some nice science and early clinical data coming from a Danish firm, NMD Pharma, and they have a small molecule drug. It's the CIC chloride channel inhibitor, NMD 670, and that improves muscle function. And they've shown in a phase 1 trial, just in about 12 patients, they did a healthy volunteer study, and then they continued the protocol into patients. And it was a complicated enough design. It was a double-blind, placebo-controlled, 3-way crossover comparison study, just to know their language. But in 12 patients, 42 to 50% were responders across different doses and time points. And again, a responder was defined as somebody with at least a 2-point reduction in the quantitative Myasthenia Gravis score, which is a 39-point score, 13 parameters, all given a weighting of 0 to 3. So that's kind of early stage. Sorry, that's early stage data, but the program is in phase 2B. And I think it's kind of interesting because it's not an immunological approach. It's really aimed at restoring function at the neuromuscular junction.
And you're absolutely right. It is at the completely other end of the spectrum of the big sledgehammers of mRNA-directed CAR-T therapy, because if it's a CRT channel, chloride channel inhibitor, I imagine it's probably an oral drug, and therefore you can give it to a much wider range of patients. And for an oral drug, rather than a CAR-T cell infusion, you could give it to a milder range of patients, and your expectations for the efficacy are less than they would be for some of these big sledgehammer approaches.
Yeah. And presumably, if it works in a larger patient population and if it works over time, you could easily see it becoming standard of care.
Yeah, baseline therapy, yeah.
Yeah, because it has a non-immunological and a non-immunosuppressive mechanism. So they've got good animal data, and they have a nice paper published in Science Translational Medicine. First named author is Martin Skov, Skov, and it appeared on the 20th of March, 2024. So if people want to...
Oh, we're out to date today, aren't we?
Yes, we are. Yeah, no, that's nice work. And there's a lot of animal data there too, obviously. And the paper just kind of summarizes what they did in the animal work, and then in both the healthy volunteers and the initial clinical observations. So it's a fairly heavyweight paper. There's a lot of data there. So it's kind of, we've come a long way from trying to find folk remedies for poison arrows.
Oh, yes. You haven't mentioned curare yet, have you?
Because actually, this is fascinating. You being an archer, especially.
Target archer. I don't hunt anyone.
I'll try to come to the...
Oh!
Apologies. But I mean, this goes back to sort of indigenous knowledge, essentially. There obviously has been long-standing traditions of using poison arrows to accelerate the dispatch of either your prey if you're hunting or your mortal enemy if you're in combat. And it was a generalized kind of a plant alkaloid preparation called curare, used in certain groups in the Central America and South America and some of the Caribbean islands. And basically, it was curare itself. It had this function. It was a paralyzing agent, and it essentially was a competitive antagonist of acetylcholine, and it worked by blocking the acetylcholine receptor. And this obviously was figured out by sort of Western scientists who had taken samples and all the rest of it and did some lab work. So some of this work was done even in the 19th and then the 20th century. But a very, very smart physician, a Scottish woman called Mary Walker, working in London, reported in 1934 in the Lancet that she was able to at least temporarily alleviate the symptoms of myasthenia gravis by administering a product called physostigmine, which was, again, a kind of a natural product that was long recognized as a sort of an antidote for curare poisoning.
Curare antidote, right.
Because she thought the signs and symptoms of curare poisoning resembled those
similar
of myasthenia
gravis. Yeah.
So I think that kind of is a very nice way to kind of set the molecular medicine ball rolling in this condition. Yes. And again, those types of agents do have a role in this condition as part of standard of care, as well as steroids and as well as non-steroidal immunosuppressant therapies, because the cholinesterase inhibitors, they just maintain high levels of acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction, so that you have a better chance of at least one molecule hitting the receptor and getting something going. So there's a lot of history here and a lot of interesting work here. And we're at a moment in time now where, the immunological paradigm that has swept across medicine is kind of dominating, because it's an area where people can get results. But I would also say keep your eye on MD Pharma. And I know that electrophysiology is a fiendishly complex field.
Yes.
And there's a great tradition, of course, in both Denmark and Sweden in that work. So I think this has been an interesting program to follow its development. But
many companies in the past have been started and not come up with anything on ion channel inhibition apart from Vertex with cystic fibrosis. So it has shown its channel inhibition has shown its effects.
Oh, yeah. I think we do have channel inhibitors that are now long since generic drugs have been around for a long time. But don't ask me off the top of my head.
Medicines, of course, yeah.
But anyway, so there we are. Myasthenia gravis. It's one of those kind of conditions that you hear about, but kind of doesn't get talked about a whole lot. But it's definitely an area that there is innovation, and I'm sure there'll be more.
Yeah, I mean, it's useful for us to have that discussion today, because it does showcase how an indication has been known about for many years and then has a background standard of therapy, mostly which is not very nice, can still be addressed by modern biotech and pharma drug development. So that's great, right?
Yeah, and that's the more of it. Okay, until the next time, Andy.
Cheers and cool. Goodbye, everyone.